Vanessa Caldwell lifted her champagne glass with a slow, deliberate smile, certain she was about to entertain the room at someone else's expense, but she had no idea she had just singled out the one woman who owned everything beneath that glittering ceiling. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The chandeliers above the Grand Meridian Ballroom shimmered like frozen stars, casting soft gold across polished marble floors where heels clicked and laughter echoed in carefully curated tones of wealth and belonging. It was the kind of room where every detail whispered exclusivity, from the crystal flutes filled with imported champagne to the tailored tuxedos and designer gowns that seemed almost like uniforms of status. Conversations floated lightly, but beneath them was an unspoken hierarchy, a silent agreement about who belonged and who did not. And then there was Clara Whitmore. She stepped through the double doors without hesitation, her dress simple, navy blue, falling just below her knees, her shoes modest, her presence quiet yet steady. No diamonds caught the light at her neck, no designer label announced her arrival, and for a moment, no one noticed her at all. But rooms like this always noticed eventually. It started with a glance, then another, subtle at first, like a ripple across still water. A woman in a silver gown leaned toward her companion, whispering behind a manicured hand. A man in a tailored suit paused mid-sentence, his eyes flicking briefly toward Clara before returning to safer conversation. The ripple grew. At the center of it all stood Vanessa Caldwell, her posture flawless, her smile practiced, her confidence sharpened by years of being the most recognized face in every room she entered. She followed the direction of the glances, her gaze landing on Clara with a slow, measuring curiosity. That quickly turned into amusement. Well, Vanessa murmured, just loud enough for those nearest her to hear, that's unexpected. A few soft chuckles followed, the kind that never quite committed but always agreed. Clara continued forward, unhurried, her eyes calm, scanning the room not with awe but with quiet familiarity, as if she had seen rooms like this before and found them lacking something essential. She approached the bar, nodding politely to the bartender, who hesitated for half a second before handing her a glass of sparkling water instead of champagne, an unconscious judgment made in less than a heartbeat. Clara accepted it without comment. Across the room, Vanessa's curiosity had already turned into intent. She moved with purpose, the crowd subtly parting for her as if guided by invisible strings. Conversations paused, eyes followed. By the time she reached Clara, a small audience had already begun to form, drawn not by invitation but by instinct. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her smile widening just enough to feel like a performance. "I don't believe we've met," she said, her tone polished but edged with something colder beneath. Clara turned to face her, her expression composed, her eyes steady. "No," she replied softly, "I don't believe we have." There was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to impress, no apology for existing in a space that had not welcomed her. And for a fraction of a second, something flickered in Vanessa's eyes, something almost like uncertainty, before it was quickly replaced by amusement again. Around them, the room seemed to lean in, conversations dimming, laughter fading into a quiet anticipation. The air shifted, subtle but undeniable. And in that moment, no one realized they were witnessing the beginning of a story that would end with silence far louder than any laughter that had filled the room before. Vanessa's smile lingered a second too long, the kind that was meant to signal control, but Clara did not mirror it, did not shrink beneath it, and that alone began to unsettle the delicate balance of the room. Vanessa let out a soft laugh, glancing briefly at the small circle forming around them as if inviting them into a private joke that Clara had unknowingly become the center of. "So," she said, swirling her champagne slowly, "who invited you?" The question was light in tone but sharp in intention, the kind that separated guests from intruders without ever raising a voice. A few heads tilted closer, eyes flickering between the two women. Clara took a small sip of her sparkling water before answering, her movements unhurried. "I was invited," she said simply. There was no elaboration, no name dropped, no attempt to justify her presence in a room that demanded credentials like currency. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, amused. "Of course," she replied, drawing out the words just enough to earn a few quiet chuckles. "It is just that this is a private gala. Not exactly the kind of event people stumble into." The laughter grew slightly louder this time, more confident, more comfortable. Clara's expression did not change. She stood with the same quiet composure, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, as though the weight of their attention did not press on her at all. That, more than anything, began to irritate Vanessa. She stepped a little closer, lowering her voice but ensuring it still carried. "You must understand," she continued, "events like this are curated. Memberships, donations, connections. It is all very specific." Her eyes drifted briefly over Clara's dress, her shoes, the absence of jewelry. "Standards matter." A man beside Vanessa smirked into his drink. Another woman adjusted her diamond bracelet, watching closely. The air tightened, subtle but unmistakable. Clara set her glass down gently on the bar, the faint clink echoing louder than it should have in the growing quiet. "I understand standards," she said, her voice calm, almost reflective. "I just do not confuse them with appearances." The words landed softly, but they carried something unexpected, something that made a few smiles falter for a fraction of a second. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained in place. "That is a lovely sentiment," she said, tilting her head, "but appearances tend to tell us quite a bit." She gestured lightly around the room, at the polished elegance, the effortless wealth. "For example, they tell us who belongs." A pause followed, thin and deliberate. Somewhere across the ballroom, a string quartet shifted into a softer melody, the notes floating through the air like a quiet contrast to the tension building here. Clara did not look away. "Do they?" she asked gently. There was no challenge in her tone, no edge, just a simple question that seemed almost out of place in a room built on certainty. Vanessa's smile tightened, just slightly. She was not used to questions that did not bend, not used to people who did not rush to fill silence with explanations. She took a sip of her champagne, buying a second, then leaned in just enough to reclaim the moment. "They do," she said. "And right now, they are saying you might be more comfortable somewhere else." The words were softer now, but far more pointed. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned in further, drawn by the quiet escalation. Clara glanced around the room, her gaze moving slowly over the chandeliers, the polished floors, the carefully arranged tables. For a brief moment, it almost looked like she was taking it all in, measuring it, weighing something unseen. Then she looked back at Vanessa. "Comfort is not really what I came here for," she said. And just like that, the room seemed to hold its breath, because something in her voice suggested that this evening was not going to unfold the way anyone expected. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass, though her smile remained polished, practiced, untouchable, at least on the surface, because control in a room like this was never about raising your voice, it was about deciding who stayed and who quietly disappeared. She let out a soft breath, then turned her gaze briefly toward a nearby staff member standing by the velvet rope that separated the main ballroom from a more exclusive lounge area where only select donors and recognized names were permitted. The gesture was subtle, but in a room built on signals, it was louder than any command. The staff member hesitated, then stepped forward with measured caution, his posture respectful but uncertain, as if he could feel the tension but did not fully understand it. "Ma'am," he said gently to Clara, offering a polite but firm smile, "this section is reserved for VIP guests only." The words were delivered with professionalism, but they carried the weight of Vanessa's silent instruction. A few guests exchanged knowing looks, their expressions shifting from curiosity to quiet satisfaction. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when the invisible line would be drawn clearly enough for everyone to see. Clara turned her head slightly toward the staff member, her expression unchanged, her eyes calm. "I am aware," she said. Her voice was soft, but it did not waver. The staff member paused, clearly unsure how to proceed, glancing briefly back toward Vanessa, who gave the faintest nod, her lips curving just enough to signal expectation. "If you would not mind," he continued, his tone tightening just a fraction, "I can escort you to the general reception area." The phrase was polite, but its meaning was unmistakable. "Move along. You do not belong here." The room seemed to lean in again, the quiet anticipation returning, sharper this time, more focused. A woman near the bar whispered something under her breath, earning a stifled laugh from her companion. The sound echoed in the stillness like a dropped glass. Clara looked down briefly, not in defeat, but as if considering something unseen, something beyond the immediate moment. Then she reached into the small clutch she carried, her movements slow and deliberate. For a second, Vanessa's smile flickered, curiosity threading through her confidence. Clara withdrew a simple envelope, unmarked, unembellished, and held it lightly between her fingers. "I was asked to deliver this personally," she said, her voice steady, almost thoughtful. The staff member blinked, caught off guard. "To whom?" he asked. Clara's gaze lifted, not to him, but past him, scanning the room with quiet certainty, as if she knew exactly where her answer would land. "To the host," she replied. A subtle shift rippled through the crowd. The word host carried weight here, more than titles or introductions. It was the axis around which the entire evening turned. Vanessa let out a soft laugh again, though this time it sounded slightly thinner. "That will not be necessary," she said smoothly, stepping forward just enough to reclaim the center of attention. "If you have something for the host, you can leave it with staff. That is how these things are handled." Clara's eyes returned to her, steady, unreadable. "That is not what I was told," she answered. The simplicity of the statement landed heavier than expected. Vanessa's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. Around them, the music continued, but it felt distant now, like a background detail no one was truly hearing anymore. The staff member shifted his weight, clearly caught between protocol and uncertainty. "Ma'am," he said again, more cautiously this time, "I really must insist." Clara did not move. She did not argue. She simply stood there, holding the envelope, her presence quiet but immovable, like something anchored far deeper than anyone in that room could yet understand. And for the first time since she had approached, Vanessa felt something unfamiliar press at the edges of her composure, not doubt exactly, but the faint, unwelcome realization that this situation was no longer unfolding according to her design, and that whatever was coming next would not be something she could easily control. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that made people shift their weight and glance at one another for reassurance, but none came, because Clara Whitmore did not move, did not explain, did not yield, and in a room built on subtle power, stillness like hers felt almost disruptive. Vanessa Caldwell let out a controlled breath, her fingers relaxing slightly around her glass as she recalibrated, because losing control in front of an audience like this was not an option, it was a risk to reputation, and reputation was everything here. She stepped forward again, her heels clicking softly against the marble, reclaiming proximity, reclaiming space. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," she said, her tone smoother now, quieter, but edged with something firmer beneath. "The host is not someone guests approach directly. That is not how these events work." Her eyes flicked briefly to the envelope in Clara's hand, then back to her face. "You are creating an unnecessary scene." A few guests nodded subtly, relieved to hear the familiar language of order being restored. The staff member straightened, encouraged by Vanessa's confidence, ready to act if needed. Clara, however, did not react to the pressure building around her. She simply looked at Vanessa, her gaze steady, almost patient, as if she were waiting for something inevitable to arrive. "I am not creating anything," Clara said softly. "I am following instructions." The words landed with quiet precision, and for a moment, Vanessa's smile faltered again, just a fraction, before she recovered. "From whom?" she asked, this time more directly, the question no longer wrapped in politeness but sharpened by irritation. The room leaned in again, drawn deeper into the exchange, the music now little more than a distant echo behind the tension gathering in the air. Clara tilted her head slightly, as if considering how much to say. "From someone who expects this to be handled correctly," she replied. The phrasing was careful, but it carried weight, the kind that did not belong to someone out of place. A murmur rippled through the nearby guests, subtle but undeniable. Vanessa felt it, the shift, the slight crack in the certainty she had been projecting. She laughed lightly, though it did not quite reach her eyes this time. "Everyone here expects things to be handled correctly," she said. "That is why there are procedures." She gestured toward the staff member again. "And right now, the procedure is for you to step away." The staff member took a cautious step closer, his voice low but firm. "Ma'am, I really do need to ask you to come with me." The words hung in the air, heavier now, more final. Around them, the circle tightened just enough to feel like a boundary, like a quiet consensus forming. Clara glanced down at the envelope once more, her fingers brushing lightly across its surface, as if confirming something only she understood. Then she looked up, her gaze shifting past Vanessa again, toward the far end of the ballroom where a raised stage stood. Beneath a larger chandelier, currently unoccupied but clearly prepared for something significant. "It will only take a moment," Clara said. Her voice was calm, but there was something in it now, something that carried beyond the immediate circle, something that made a few heads turn even from across the room. Vanessa followed her line of sight instinctively, her expression tightening as she noticed the subtle movement near the stage, a cluster of event organizers whispering to one another, glancing toward the crowd with growing urgency. The staff member hesitated, caught between his instructions and the shifting energy he could no longer ignore. Clara took a single step forward, not aggressive, not defiant, just deliberate, and the motion alone seemed to ripple outward, causing the circle around her to part slightly without anyone consciously deciding to move. Vanessa felt it then, unmistakably, the loss of control slipping through her fingers, not in a dramatic collapse, but in small, quiet fractures that added up too quickly to ignore. "Stop," Vanessa said, her voice firmer now, louder than before, cutting through the murmur. Clara paused, turning her head just enough to meet her eyes again. For a brief moment, the two women stood in perfect stillness, the room suspended around them. And in that silence, something shifted completely, because for the first time, it was not Clara who seemed out of place, it was the certainty Vanessa had built her entire presence upon, and it was beginning to unravel in front of everyone. The word hung in the air, sharp and immovable, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire ballroom paused around it, every clink of glass, every whisper, every movement slowing into a single shared breath as all eyes fixed on Clara Whitmore and the envelope still resting lightly in her hand. Clara did not react immediately, and that delay, that quiet refusal to rush or defend herself, only deepened the tension that now pressed against the room like an invisible weight. She turned fully toward Vanessa Caldwell, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, as though nothing about this moment felt unusual to her at all. "You are making a mistake," Vanessa said, her voice lower now but edged with urgency, the kind that came from sensing something slipping beyond control. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those who did not know her well, but to those who did, it was unmistakable. This was no longer performance. This was reaction. Clara regarded her for a second longer, then spoke with the same quiet steadiness that had unsettled the room from the moment she arrived. "No," she said gently. "I think that part already happened." A murmur moved through the crowd, not loud, but enough to ripple outward, enough to shift the atmosphere again, because now it was no longer just curiosity driving the attention, it was anticipation. Something was about to break, and everyone could feel it. Near the stage, the cluster of event organizers grew more animated, one of them speaking urgently into a headset while another scanned the room with widening eyes. The staff member who had been standing beside Clara hesitated again, his authority now clearly uncertain, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to confusion. He glanced toward Vanessa, waiting for direction, but even she seemed momentarily unsure. And then it happened. A soft chime echoed through the ballroom, cutting cleanly through the layered sounds of the evening, followed by the subtle dimming of the lights just enough to draw attention toward the stage. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Glasses were lowered. Heads turned. The room shifted its focus as one, drawn toward the raised platform where a single spotlight flickered to life. A man in a tailored black suit stepped onto the stage, holding a microphone, his expression composed but carrying a hint of urgency beneath it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice amplified and clear, filling the space with effortless authority, "may I have your attention, please?" The room fell completely silent. The kind of silence that did not need to be asked for twice. Vanessa's gaze snapped toward the stage, her posture stiffening as something unfamiliar tightened in her chest. Clara did not move. She simply stood where she was, her eyes lifting slightly toward the light, as if this moment had been expected all along. "We would like to take a moment," the host continued, "to recognize someone very important to tonight's event." A ripple of polite anticipation moved through the audience, the kind reserved for major donors, for names that carried weight. Vanessa's shoulders relaxed just slightly, her confidence beginning to reassemble itself. This was familiar territory. Recognition, hierarchy, validation. This was her world again. This evening would not be possible, the host went on, without the extraordinary generosity and vision of our primary benefactor. The words settled into the room with growing significance. A few guests began to glance at one another, quietly speculating, trying to anticipate the name that would soon be spoken. Vanessa lifted her chin, a faint smile returning, ready to acknowledge whichever name was about to be celebrated, ready to align herself with it as she always did. But then the host paused, just long enough to let the moment breathe, just long enough to let the anticipation build to its peak. And in that suspended second, something shifted again, something deeper, something irreversible, because Clara Whitmore took a single, quiet step forward, still holding the envelope, her presence aligning almost perfectly with the center of the room's attention, and though no one said it yet, though no name had been spoken, the air itself seemed to recognize what was coming, and it was not what anyone had expected. The pause stretched just long enough to feel intentional, and in that suspended moment, every person in the ballroom seemed to lean forward without realizing it, drawn into a tension they could not yet explain, as if the air itself had thickened with expectation. The host adjusted his grip on the microphone, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before settling, not on the front tables where the usual names sat, but somewhere deeper within the room, somewhere unexpected. "Our benefactor," he continued, his voice steady but carrying a subtle note of reverence, "has chosen to remain out of the spotlight for many years, preferring impact over recognition, substance over display." A faint murmur passed through the guests. Curiosity sharpening into something more focused now, something almost uneasy. Vanessa Caldwell felt it too, the shift in tone, the unfamiliar direction of the narrative, and for the first time that evening, her confidence did not immediately return to fill the space. She turned slightly, following the host's line of sight, her eyes scanning the room with growing intensity. Clara Whitmore stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, the envelope still resting lightly in her hand, her gaze calm as it met the distant light of the stage. She did not step forward again. She did not signal for attention. She simply remained. "Tonight," the host said, his voice rising just enough to carry clearly into every corner of the ballroom, "we are honored to finally acknowledge the individual whose vision and generosity have shaped not only this event, but the entire foundation behind it." The words landed with weight now, undeniable, pulling every thread of attention tighter. A few guests began to shift uncomfortably, their earlier amusement dissolving into something far less certain. Vanessa's grip tightened imperceptibly on her glass, her mind racing through names, possibilities, trying to anchor herself to something familiar, something that would restore order. But nothing came. The silence deepened. And then the host spoke again, slower this time, deliberate. "Ms. Clara Whitmore." The name echoed through the ballroom like a quiet detonation. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the room itself refused to process what it had just heard. Then heads turned, one by one, then all at once, drawn toward Clara as if pulled by an unseen force. The shift was immediate and absolute. The laughter from earlier vanished completely, replaced by a stillness so complete it felt almost fragile. Vanessa froze. Not dramatically, not visibly to those who did not know her, but in the smallest details, the slight widening of her eyes, the tightening of her jaw, the way her breath seemed to catch just enough to betray the crack forming beneath her composure. Clara did not react to the name as if it were a revelation. She did not look surprised, did not look proud. She simply turned her gaze back toward the stage, as though this moment had been expected all along, as though everything that had happened before it had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. The staff member who had tried to escort her away stepped back instinctively, his posture shifting from authority to deference in a single, quiet motion. Around them, the guests who had stood closest began to create space without being asked, stepping aside, clearing a path that had not existed seconds before. The room had redefined itself in an instant. The host continued, his tone now unmistakably respectful. Ms. Whitmore's contributions have transformed countless lives, though she has never once sought recognition for it. Each word seemed to deepen the silence rather than break it. Clara glanced down briefly at the envelope in her hand, then back toward the stage, her expression unchanged, her presence still grounded, still quiet. But now, everything around her had shifted. And in that silence, louder than any applause that might come later, the room began to understand not just who she was, but what they had done, and the realization settled over them like something heavy, something impossible to ignore. For a moment that felt longer than it was, no one dared to move, as if even the smallest sound might shatter the fragile realization settling over the room, and then, almost instinctively, the crowd began to part more deliberately, not out of curiosity now, but out of respect that had arrived far too late. Clara Whitmore took another step forward, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, but the space around her transformed with each movement, the same people who had once leaned in to watch her humiliation now stepping aside to create a clear path toward the stage. The marble floor echoed softly beneath her shoes, each step measured, each sound amplified by the silence that followed her like a shadow. Vanessa Caldwell remained exactly where she stood, her body still, her expression carefully held together, but the shift in her presence was undeniable, the effortless confidence she had worn like a second skin now fractured by something she could not immediately repair. Her eyes followed Clara, but there was no longer any amusement in them, only the slow, dawning awareness of what had just unfolded, and more importantly, what it meant. The host stepped slightly back from the microphone, his posture adjusting as Clara approached, his earlier authority replaced by a quiet deference that did not need to be announced. A member of the event staff quickly moved to guide her up the small set of steps leading to the stage, their gestures precise, respectful, almost reverent. The envelope remained in Clara's hand, simple and unremarkable against the backdrop of polished elegance, yet somehow it now carried a weight that no one could ignore. As she reached the stage, the light above shifted subtly, catching her in a soft glow that revealed nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic, just the same composed presence she had carried from the moment she entered the room. She did not rush to the microphone. She did not acknowledge the stares, the whispers that had now turned into something entirely different, something closer to disbelief. She simply stood there for a second, allowing the silence to settle fully, allowing the room to feel the distance between what they had assumed and what was now undeniable. In the crowd below, expressions had changed completely. The quiet laughter from earlier had vanished, replaced by lowered gazes, tightened lips, and the kind of stillness that came from realizing a mistake could not be undone. A woman who had once whispered now stared down at her glass, as if it suddenly demanded her full attention. A man who had smirked earlier shifted his stance, his confidence dissolving into awkwardness. And at the center of it all, Vanessa stood frozen in place, her champagne glass untouched, her mind replaying every word, every glance, every moment she had so confidently controlled, now reassembled into something far less flattering. Clara finally stepped closer to the microphone, placing the envelope gently on the podium before her. The faint sound it made against the surface echoed more than it should have, a quiet punctuation to everything that had come before. She looked out over the room. Her gaze steady, not searching for validation, not seeking approval, but simply observing. For a brief moment, her eyes passed over Vanessa, not lingering, not accusing, just acknowledging, and that fleeting glance carried more weight than any confrontation could have. Then she spoke, her voice calm, clear, and entirely unshaken. "I was told this evening was about impact," she said, her words carrying effortlessly through the room, filling the silence without breaking it. She paused just long enough for the meaning to settle. "Not appearances." The words were simple, almost understated, but they landed with undeniable force, because in that moment, no one in the room could separate themselves from what they meant. No one could pretend they had not seen, had not participated, had not judged. And as the silence deepened once more, it was no longer empty. It was full, heavy with understanding, with regret, and with the quiet realization that everything they believed about status, about belonging, had just been rewritten in front of them. The silence that followed Clara's words did not break immediately, it settled deeper, heavier, as if the entire room needed time to absorb what had just been placed before them, not as an accusation, not as a confrontation, but as something far more difficult to dismiss, a quiet truth that left no room for denial. Clara did not rush to fill that silence. She stood with the same composed stillness, her hands resting lightly against the edges of the podium, her gaze steady, allowing the weight of the moment to exist exactly as it was. Below her, the guests shifted uneasily, the earlier confidence that had defined the room now replaced with something far less certain. No one spoke. No one laughed. Even the faint clinking of glasses had disappeared, as if the room itself had chosen to remain still. Clara reached for the envelope she had carried since the beginning of the evening and opened it with deliberate care, the soft sound of paper unfolding echoing more than it should have in the quiet. She glanced down briefly, then lifted her eyes again, her voice calm as she continued. "For years, this foundation has operated on a simple principle," she said, each word measured, each sentence landing with clarity. "That real change does not come from recognition. It comes from intention." A few heads lifted slightly, drawn not by spectacle, but by the sincerity in her tone. "The programs supported tonight," she went on, "have provided education, housing, and resources to communities that most people never see, never visit, and too often, never consider." Her voice did not rise, did not demand attention, and yet every person in the room listened. Not because they were being asked to, but because they no longer had the certainty to look away. "I chose not to attend events like this for a long time," Clara continued, her eyes scanning the room slowly, not judging, not searching, simply observing. "Not because they are unimportant, but because I wanted the work to speak for itself." She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "But tonight, I was asked to come in person." Her gaze shifted briefly toward the host, then back to the crowd. "To ensure that something was delivered directly." She lifted the contents of the envelope slightly, not displaying it, but acknowledging its purpose. A quiet tension returned, different now, focused, uncertain. "A decision," Clara said simply. The word carried weight without explanation, and the room felt it. Vanessa Caldwell stood among the guests, her posture rigid, her expression carefully held together, but the confidence that once anchored her presence was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt more like restraint than control. Clara's voice remained steady. "Beginning next quarter, the foundation will be expanding its partnerships," she said. "But not based on appearances, influence, or reputation." The words were gentle, but they cut through the room with undeniable precision. A few guests exchanged glances, understanding dawning in quiet, uncomfortable waves. "We will be working with individuals and organizations that demonstrate something far more valuable," Clara continued. "Respect. Integrity. And the ability to recognize worth without needing it to be displayed." Her gaze passed over the room again, and though she did not stop on anyone, the meaning reached everyone. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with realization, with reflection, with the quiet awareness that this moment would carry consequences far beyond this evening. Clara lowered the paper back into the envelope and set it gently on the podium. She did not add anything more. She did not need to. Because in that moment, the room understood that what had been revealed was not just her identity, not just her influence, but the standard by which everything would now be measured, and no one in that room could pretend they had not already been seen. No applause came at first, and that absence spoke louder than any standing ovation ever could, because the people in that room were not yet ready to celebrate, they were still processing, still confronting the quiet realization that the person they had dismissed so easily now stood above them not just in wealth, but in something far less tangible and far more difficult to imitate. Clara Whitmore did not wait for a reaction. She simply stepped back from the podium, her movements calm, unhurried, as though the moment had already fulfilled its purpose. The host moved forward again, clearly prepared to continue the program, but even he hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if uncertain how to follow what had just taken place. Eventually, a polite, restrained applause began, scattered at first, then gradually building, though it lacked the easy enthusiasm that had filled the room earlier. This was not celebration. This was acknowledgement. Below the stage, the guests shifted, their earlier confidence replaced by careful composure. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, no longer filled with laughter, but with quiet reflection. A few individuals avoided eye contact entirely, focusing instead on their glasses, their phones, anything that allowed them to escape the weight of what had just happened. Vanessa Caldwell remained where she stood, her posture still upright, her expression carefully neutral, but something fundamental had changed. The effortless control she once carried was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt more like restraint than confidence. She watched as Clara stepped down from the stage, the crowd once again parting for her, though this time there was no hesitation, no judgment, only a quiet respect that had arrived far too late. Clara walked past the same faces that had once observed her with amusement, and now those same faces lowered slightly, their expressions softened, uncertain, as if searching for a response that no longer felt appropriate. When she passed Vanessa, the space between them held a different kind of tension, not sharp, not confrontational, but heavy with everything that had already been said without words. Vanessa opened her mouth slightly, as if to speak, to offer something that might repair the moment, but nothing came. There were no words that could reshape what had already been revealed. Clara paused just long enough to acknowledge her presence, her gaze steady, not unkind, but not inviting either. It was not a moment of victory. It was something quieter, something more final. Then she continued walking, her steps echoing softly across the marble floor as she moved toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. The same doors that had once framed her entrance now opened again, and she stepped through them without hesitation, leaving behind a room that felt fundamentally different from the one she had entered. Inside, the chandeliers still glowed, the music still played, the glasses still clinked, but the atmosphere